Is revolution progress? This question has been asked to many different people and many different historians around the globe. None of these people know what the true answer is because there isn't one. Many people are even wondering what revolution means. Google says that the definition of revolution is a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. This seems like a good enough definition of a revolution, but that definition is not good enough. Let's say that when it says in favor of a new system, the new system is actually worse than the old way. Also, the old ways could have not changed. For example, in the French Revolution, they started with an absolute monarchy, King Louis XVI, and ended with Napoleon, a self-named emperor. Even though many people say that the revolution is not progress, I'd say that the revolution is progress. As I said before, the French Revolution started and ended with absolutism, but there was a lot of progress throughout the revolution. Even though Napoleon took over after the revolution, he gained a lot of power when he was emperor. He had most of the land and power in Europe, except for Russia, and after Napoleon got abdicated and exiled to Elba, the throne went to King Louis XVIII. King Louis XVIII was actually a pretty good king. King Louis XVIII promised a constitutional monarchy, which is when a monarchy shares some of its power with a constitutional organized government. King Louis XVIII also promised a bicameral parliament, religious tolerance, and a constitutional rights for all citizens. After King Louis XVIII promised all of these and wrote a draft for the Constitution, his power got taken over by Napoleon again when he returned to France after fleeing from his exile. After Napoleon got power again, the Austrians, British, Prussians, and Russians all considered Napoleon to be an enemy and started the 100-day campaign. In the 100-day campaign, Napoleon lost the fight and was exiled again and was never to come back. After Napoleon got exiled again, King Louis XVIII came into power and enforced what he promised to do. He didn't do great because the Constitution gave a lot of power to right-wing royalists, but all of this was definitely progress. Even after the revolution, the ideas that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities were an important force. Also, the idea of liberalism, which is the idea of being open and willing to respect other people's ideas, behaviors, and opinions, was important to most people. This all shows how much progress the French Revolution had on France and even all of Europe. Another example of a revolution that showed progress was the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution took place in the country of Saint Domingo, now named Haiti. And back then, Saint Domingo was a pirate outpost. These pirates raided some Spanish ships, and the Spanish ships were loaded with silver. So they invested the silver into sugar plantations, which were actually thriving. This island was one of the most valuable colonies in the entire world at the time. It had the second most slaves in a colony, trailing behind Brazil. Most of these slaves were African-born because there were so many diseases and horrible living conditions. There were 4 groups on the island of Saint Domingo: the rich white men that owned plantations, the rich people of color that either served in the militia or owned slaves and plantations, the poor whites that were either artisans or laborers, and finally, at the bottom, were the slaves. The thing is, slaves made up most of the population of Saint Domingo. Once the French Revolution occurred, all of the people on the island did not like it. There were very high tensions, so when France said that all people of color, rich and slave-owning people of color, were granted French citizenship, the rich white people did not like this. This created fighting between the rich white people and the rich people of color. The slaves really did not like it, and they were most of the population, so they revolted. There was a main leader among the slaves, Louverture. Louverture taught the slaves to be a working army. After the Spanish heard of the French fighting on this island, the Spanish came to help the French, because at the time, Napoleon was wreaking havoc in Europe, and the Spanish and the French were enemies. Also, for even more help, the British also helped the slaves. This caused the French to retreat because they knew they couldn't fight the Spanish, the British, and the slaves. Because of France not being able to fight them, they decided to free the slaves. So all the slaves on Saint Domingo got freed. Even though all of the slaves were freed, they still had plantations. They were just paid now. This all show how a revolution can be progress because slaves were freed and hundreds of slaves were now being paid. The French revolutions and revolutions in general can be seen as progress in many different ways throughout all of history. Now that you've seen this, you can see how revolutions have changed for the better, but also for the worse. This is why revolutions can be seen as progress to the whole world.